He was born Meyer Lansky, but history would remember him as Meyer Lansky, a name whispered in the corners of smoke-filled rooms and echoed through the vaults of America's criminal underworld. His story doesn't begin with blood or bullets like most gangsters. It begins with numbers, cold, clean, and untraceable. The kind of numbers that could build empires, silence enemies, and make men like Al Capone kneel to balance sheets instead of guns. Long before the Mafia called him their secret accountant, he was just a poor boy from Grodno, a crumbling corner of what was once Poland and now Belarus. The year was 1902. His family lived in a world suffocating under persecution, where being Jewish meant being second class at best and hunted at worst. His father, Max, worked as a tailor, mending the clothes of men who'd never give him respect. His mother, Yetta, struggled to keep the family fed. For young Meyer, survival was the first arithmetic he ever learned, the math of hunger, the sum of fear, the subtraction of dreams. In 1911, when he was only 9 years old, the Lansky family boarded a ship bound for the United States, the land of opportunity. But opportunity had a cruel sense of humor. They arrived at Ellis Island like millions of others, exhausted and wide-eyed, only to find that the streets weren't paved with gold, but with sweat and dirt. The Lower East Side of Manhattan was a noisy, restless battlefield of cultures. Immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe packed into narrow tenements where hope was scarce and crime was cheap. It was in these crowded blocks that Meyer learned the real lessons that would shape him. He was small, quiet, and sharp-eyed, a boy who listened more than he spoke. The streets were ruled by fists, but Meyer understood something most didn't. Brains could be sharper than brass knuckles. Still, he didn't shy from the roughness around him. Fights were part of survival, but so was learning when not to fight. That was his first taste of power. Restraint. As a teenager, he met another boy from the neighborhood, Benjamin Siegel. Everyone called him Bugsy. Bugsy was everything Meyer wasn't: tall, handsome, reckless, violent. But beneath that chaos, Meyer saw something useful: ambition. Together they became a strange pair, like fire and ice. Bugsy handled the muscle. Meyer handled the money. It was a friendship that would define the next 3 decades of organized crime. The two of them hustled small time at first: dice games, bootlegging, protection rackets. But while others fought for scraps, Meyer kept his eyes on patterns. He'd watch where money flowed, how it disappeared, and where it could be multiplied. When Prohibition hit America in 1920, it was chaos for most and opportunity for a few. The streets flooded with illegal liquor, and gangsters fought for control. But Lansky didn't just want to sell booze. He wanted to structure it, to make it run like a corporation. He was a thinker in a world of hitters. He studied men like Rothstein and Luciano, men who saw crime not as violence, but as business. He started organizing the numbers, the routes, the payouts. When others were counting bullets, Meyer was counting profits. He understood that power wasn't just about who held the gun. It was about who paid for it. Even in his early 20s, Lansky had a mind that could turn chaos into order. He started small gambling rings, and soon his name became synonymous with trust. Gangsters didn't trust easily, but they trusted Meyer. He never cheated them, never stole from them, and always delivered what he promised. He didn't need to shout to command respect. His calm demeanor and sharp mind were enough. The Jewish immigrant boy who once went hungry was now the man quietly pulling strings behind the city's most dangerous figures. But it wasn't money alone that drove him. It was the precision of it all, the satisfaction of watching his plans unfold like an equation that always balanced. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of killers and leave them silent with a single statement of logic. Still, for all his intellect, the shadows he navigated were filled with risk. Every deal carried betrayal. Every ally carried ambition. And while Meyer avoided bloodshed whenever he could, violence was never far away. He saw men die for greed, pride, and stupidity, 3 currencies he never spent. But he had one weakness: loyalty. He stood by his friends, especially Bugsy. Their bond was unbreakable, even when Bugsy's temper became a liability. When Lucky Luciano began building his criminal syndicate, Meyer and Bugsy joined him. It was the birth of something entirely new, a national crime organization built on logic, structure, and profit. Lansky helped design it. The Commission, as they called it, became the unseen government of the underworld, and Meyer was its accountant. the man who made sure the numbers told no tales. By the late 1920s, he was already known in quiet circles as the mob's banker, but if you'd met him then, you'd never guess it. He didn't wear flashy suits or drive extravagant cars. He wasn't the type to flaunt wealth or power. He moved like a shadow, always understated, always composed. He believed in control of money, emotion, and image. While others made headlines, he made history quietly. Yet beneath that calm surface, Lansky carried the memory of poverty, a reminder of where he'd come from and what he'd vowed never to return to. The world around him was shifting fast. The Great Depression hit, and while honest men lost their homes and jobs, Meyer's empire grew. Gambling, loan sharking, and smuggling thrived in desperate times. People would always chase luck, and Meyer made sure to sell it to them at a profit. But what truly set him apart wasn't just his intelligence. It was his vision. He saw organized crime evolving beyond the streets, beyond violence. He dreamed of something clean, a system of casinos, investments, offshore accounts, where illegal money could be washed until it gleamed. He wasn't just a gangster. He was an architect designing the financial future of the underworld. And yet, despite his growing influence, Lansky still operated from the background. He had no interest in ruling territories or flaunting power like Capone or Luciano. His kingdom was invisible, numbers on paper, accounts in foreign banks, coded ledgers known only to him. He was the ghost in the machine, the quiet hand that made the mafia rich. But success didn't erase the danger. The streets remembered, and so did the law. Federal agents were beginning to notice patterns, fortunes that appeared from nowhere, money trails that ended in smoke. Lansky knew it was only a matter of time before the spotlight turned his way. But he also knew something else. Knowledge was armor. And he had more of it than anyone. Even as America's criminal landscape became bloodier, Meyer Lansky's legend grew not through violence but through precision. He showed the mafia how to think like businessmen, how to manage assets, how to move dirty money through clean channels. He made crime look civilized, and for a time, he believed that if he stayed invisible, if he remained just another quiet man walking the streets of New York, he could outlast them all. But the thing about shadows is, they stretch. And the deeper a man moves into them, the harder it becomes to tell where the light ends. Meyer Lansky's story was just beginning, and the world would soon learn that the most dangerous gangster in America didn't carry a gun. He carried a ledger. By the early 1930s, Meyer Lansky had learned that power didn't always roar, it whispered. While the streets of New York echoed with gunfire and gang wars, Meyer was building something quieter, cleaner, and infinitely more dangerous. A criminal empire run like a corporation. Every man in the underworld wanted to be a boss. Meyer wanted to be the system behind them all. Prohibition had transformed the country into a gold rush for gangsters. While men like Al Capone flaunted their empires with champagne and machine guns, Meyer operated from the shadows, turning bootlegging into a science. His friendship with Lucky Luciano deepened during these years. Lucky was the visionary with street charisma. Meyer was the strategist with the numbers. Together they would change the way organized crime functioned in America forever. They saw what others couldn't, that the mafia, divided along ethnic and territorial lines, was wasting potential. The old Sicilian code of loyalty was becoming a liability. Luciano wanted structure, and Lansky provided it. Over late-night meetings in smoky back rooms, the two designed what would become known as the National Crime Syndicate, a unified organization that brought together Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs under a single umbrella of profit and order. Lansky's influence wasn't about commands or threats. It was about logic. He convinced killers and thieves to follow rules because, in the end, rules meant stability, and stability meant more money. He crafted the mafia's financial backbone, setting up systems of accounting, laundering, and distribution that kept everyone paid and quiet. For every illegal dollar that passed through the syndicate's hands, Meyer knew exactly where it went. He also knew how to make it disappear. It was during this time that Meyer's true gift revealed itself, his ability to turn chaos into order through finance. He began investing in legitimate fronts, restaurants, car dealerships, laundry services, anything that could absorb dirty money and spit out clean profits. He used coded ledgers, false identities, and offshore banks before most lawmen even knew such things existed. If Al Capone represented the muscle of organized crime, Meyer Lansky was its brain, but his rise wasn't without risk. In the early 1930s, as gangland violence escalated, the government cracked down on mob activity. Prohibition was nearing its end, and the bootlegging economy that had made men rich was about to dry up. Meyer saw the end coming before anyone else did. He understood that the future wasn't in alcohol, it was in gambling. People would always crave the thrill of risk, the illusion of control, and the rush of winning. Gambling was eternal. He began building gambling operations across the United States, in New Orleans, Florida, and later Cuba. These weren't backroom craps tables or smoky pool halls. Meyer wanted class. He envisioned casinos run like hotels where crime hid behind tuxedos and cocktails. To achieve it, he needed allies who could handle the rougher edges of his plan, and no one fit that role better than his old friend Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy had always been the wild one. While Meyer plotted in silence, Bugsy lit up rooms with violence and charm. Together they balanced each other, the cold accountant and the fiery enforcer. But as the stakes grew, so did Bugsy's recklessness. Still, Meyer trusted him even when logic warned otherwise. Their loyalty to each other went beyond business. It was brotherhood forged in the streets of New York. When the federal government repealed Prohibition in 1933, most gangsters scrambled to reinvent themselves. Lansky was already 10 steps ahead. He and Luciano expanded their network into narcotics, extortion, and labor racketeering. But Meyer focused on the long game, building financial systems that would survive law enforcement and rival assassinations alike. He was the first to propose internationalizing organized crime's profits. Offshore accounts in Switzerland and Panama became his secret weapons. He also had another advantage. He wasn't Italian. That meant he could operate in worlds closed off to traditional mafia figures. Jewish businessmen, foreign investors, and corrupt officials found him approachable, even trustworthy. He was fluent in both the language of crime and the language of commerce. With a calm demeanor and a mind like a chessboard, he made allies where others made enemies. In 1931, after Luciano orchestrated the assassination of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the last of the old guard bosses, Lansky helped him form the Commission, a governing body for organized crime. It was an unprecedented move. Instead of bloody turf wars, disputes would now be settled by vote. Meyer's hand was invisible but essential in shaping this new world order. He made sure the structure ran smoothly, that every venture was profitable, and that money flowed efficiently from the streets to the syndicate's coffers. But Meyer's rise wasn't just about wealth. It was about control, not of others, but of himself. In an underworld ruled by ego and blood, he was the rare man who didn't crave the spotlight. He understood that fame was fatal. The quieter he stayed, the safer he became, and that quietness gave him power others could only dream of. His methods of laundering money became so intricate that even the most determined investigators couldn't trace the trail. The FBI would later describe his financial operations as a spider web with no center. He'd use cash from illegal casinos to buy into legitimate businesses, then recycle the profits into more criminal enterprises. A cycle so smooth it looked clean from every angle. Still, there were moments when even Lansky's precision couldn't prevent chaos. As the 1930s turned into the 1940s, World War II loomed over America. The Mafia saw opportunity, but Meyer saw something deeper: leverage. He helped coordinate an unlikely partnership between the U.S. government and organized crime to protect the New York docks from Nazi sabotage. It was called Operation Underworld. In return, Luciano's prison sentence was reduced, and Meyer's influence within both the criminal world and political circles quietly expanded. After the war, Meyer Lansky was no longer just a mob accountant. He was a global financier of crime. He had connections in Havana, London, and Las Vegas. He helped bankroll Bugsy Siegel's dream of turning a dusty Nevada town into a gambler's paradise. At first, the idea of building a luxury casino in the middle of the desert sounded insane, but Meyer saw potential in it. If they could make gambling respectable, they could make it unstoppable. He backed Siegel with millions, not because the numbers made sense, but because loyalty demanded it. Bugsy built the Flamingo, a gleaming monument to risk and glamour. But the project spiraled out of control. Costs ballooned, profits vanished, and Bugsy's recklessness turned investors furious. Meyer defended him as long as he could, but numbers don't lie, and the numbers spelled death. When Siegel was murdered in 1947, Meyer was silent. He didn't order the hit, but he didn't stop it either. For all his logic, for all his intelligence, that moment broke something inside him. The boy from the Lower East Side who had once fought alongside his wild friend now sat alone, watching as emotion finally lost to arithmetic. Still, the machine he built didn't stop. It couldn't. By the end of the 1940s, Meyer Lansky controlled or influenced gambling operations across the United States and the Caribbean. He had become the invisible architect of a new kind of empire, one that ran on probability, not bullets. He operated with a philosophy that bordered on fatalism. He once told an associate, "We're all going to die. The trick is not to let it happen before we make our mark." And make his mark he did. He was untouchable, not because he was invincible, but because he was indispensable. Even when law enforcement tried to corner him, they found nothing solid. No paper trails, no witnesses willing to talk, no one who could even confirm where his money truly went. He existed everywhere and nowhere. The syndicate needed him, and he needed the shadows. For Meyer Lansky, the rise to power wasn't a climb. It was a calculation. Every move was deliberate, every friendship strategic, every silence meaningful. While others chased fame, he built a legacy of invisibility, a legacy that would outlive bullets, prisons, and time itself. And yet, beneath the calm and the precision, there was always the ghost of the boy from Grodno, the child who once counted the coins his father earned, dreaming of a life where the numbers always added up. Now those numbers ran empires, but they also carried a cost he would soon be forced to pay. By the early 1950s, Meyer Lansky was no longer just a man. He was an institution. The mob's invisible accountant, the kingmaker behind the kings, the quiet storm in a world built on noise. His influence reached from the dimly lit casinos of Havana to the rising neon glow of Las Vegas, from the marble floors of Florida's hotels to the discreet offices of Swiss banks. Every dollar that passed through the underworld seemed to echo his touch. He was calm, measured, and untouchable, or so it seemed. For all his power, Lansky never looked the part. He wasn't a towering gangster with a fedora and a cigar. He was a small, soft-spoken man who could disappear in a crowd. He rarely raised his voice, never bragged, and avoided violence unless absolutely necessary. Yet behind that quiet exterior, he controlled more money than most Wall Street bankers. He had built an empire not of soldiers but of systems. His weapon was intelligence, and his battlefield was balance sheets. The post-war years were good to Meyer. The world was rebuilding, and so was organized crime. The Mafia had expanded its reach into construction, unions, and Hollywood. But for Lansky, the true treasure wasn't in muscle, it was in gaming. Gambling had become his obsession, his masterpiece. It was the perfect blend of psychology and probability, where human weakness became profit and chance could be controlled with precision. Havana, Cuba, became the jewel of his empire. Under the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, Meyer found paradise for businessmen like him. The island was open to deals, the government was corrupt, and the law could be bought. Batista welcomed American money, and Lansky brought it by the suitcase. Soon, Havana was transformed into a playground for the rich. Casinos, hotels, and cabarets lined the streets like glittering temples of temptation. The Riviera, the National, and the Capri all bore Lansky's invisible signature. He didn't just build casinos. He built an economy. The Cuban government received its cut, the mob cleaned its cash, and tourists flocked to the island to gamble under chandeliers and palm trees. It was a utopia of corruption, organized, efficient, and lucrative. Lansky called it his baby, the perfect fusion of legitimate business and criminal opportunity. While others sought glory, Meyer sought stability. He didn't need to rule Cuba. He only needed to control its heartbeat, money. Batista gave him that in exchange for loyalty and bribes, and for a time it worked beautifully. Havana became the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean, and Lansky was its quiet emperor. He moved through the lobbies like a polite ghost, always smiling, always watching. But even paradise has cracks. In the background, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro was gathering momentum. The Cuban Revolution was simmering, and while the tourists danced and the roulette wheels spun, The foundation beneath Meyer's empire began to tremble. He ignored the warning signs at first. Revolutions came and went, but money always stayed. At least that's what he told himself. Back in the United States, his influence stretched even further. In Las Vegas, Bugsy Siegel's dream had survived his death. The Flamingo had become a success, and new casinos were rising out of the desert like mirages. The mob was investing heavily, and once again, Lansky's steady hands managed the flow. He taught them how to skim profits cleanly, how to move funds through foreign fronts, how to turn every chip into an untraceable dollar. He didn't just manage money, he managed men. The most dangerous figures in the country sought his advice. Even the Italian dons deferred to him. He wasn't a member of the Mafia, but his counsel was as binding as blood. Luciano once said, "If Meyer says it's good, it's good." That was the kind of authority no title could give. Despite his enormous reach, Meyer lived simply. He never built a mansion, never hired bodyguards, never surrounded himself with luxury. He owned modest homes in Florida and New York, always blending in, always understated. He knew visibility was vulnerability. Fame killed gangsters. Anonymity made them immortal. Still, the FBI was watching. J. Edgar Hoover had built his reputation on the promise of cracking down on organized crime, and though Hoover himself refused to publicly admit the Mafia's existence for years, his agents were tracking Meyer closely. They followed him to Havana, to Florida, to New York. But every time they thought they had him cornered, the evidence vanished. Meyer left no paper trail, no witnesses, no direct ownership of anything. Everything was held through shell companies, nominees, and coded ledgers. He was a ghost wearing a tie, but ghosts can't stay invisible forever. When Castro's revolution finally erupted in 1959, Lansky's Cuban paradise collapsed overnight. Rebel forces stormed Havana, and the new government seized all assets tied to Batista's regime, including Meyer's casinos. Overnight, the empire he had spent decades perfecting vanished. Millions of dollars in investments gone. His hotels, his gaming halls, even his secret vaults, all taken by men who despised everything he represented. It was a devastating blow. For the first time, Meyer Lansky lost control. He watched from Miami as the world he built burned, knowing there was nothing he could do. For years he had believed in his own invincibility, that intelligence could outmaneuver fate. But fate, as he learned, had its own mathematics. No formula could solve revolution. No bribe could stop ideology. Still, Lansky didn't crumble. He adapted. That was his greatest gift, survival through reinvention. He shifted focus to the Bahamas, where gambling laws were looser and the government was pliable. He began investing quietly in casinos and resorts, keeping his name off the books. He still had influence in Las Vegas and partners in Europe. Money moved, but Meyer never stopped calculating. Even in loss, he found angles. His empire became a web spanning continents. Legal in some places, illegal in others, but always profitable. He was rumored to have secret accounts in Switzerland containing hundreds of millions. When asked, he would simply smile and say, "People believe what they want to believe." But power, no matter how subtle, attracts enemies. Law enforcement intensified its pursuit. The IRS launched investigations into his finances. Journalists began calling him the mob's accountant, turning the quiet man into a public figure, the very thing he'd spent his life avoiding. And with the public attention came scrutiny, speculation, and pressure. He was aging now, his hair thinning, his health fading. Yet his mind remained razor sharp. He knew every number, every face, every debt owed. He knew which politicians were bought, which agents were corrupt, which partners were reliable. He had seen it all: prohibition, war, revolutions, betrayals, and through it all, he remained standing. In those years, Meyer Lansky became something of a myth. To some, he was a criminal genius. To others, a devil in a suit. But to those who truly understood him, he was something else entirely. A man who had mastered control in a world built on chaos. Still, the cracks were spreading. His longtime friends were dying, imprisoned, or turning on each other. Luciano was in exile in Italy. The younger generation of mobsters lacked discipline, obsessed with quick money and bloodshed. The order Meyer helped build was starting to rot from within, and for the first time, he began to feel something he had always managed to avoid: fear. Not of death, but of exposure. governments around the world began tightening financial regulations. Offshore banking was no longer the impenetrable fortress it once was. Investigators were getting smarter, and Meyer's old tricks were losing their edge. He tried to retire quietly, but the law didn't forget. The U.S. government wanted him to pay, not for what they could prove, but for everything they couldn't. He began spending more time in Miami Beach, living a quiet life by the ocean. To the casual observer, he looked like any aging retiree, a man feeding pigeons, reading newspapers, and watching the waves roll in. But behind that calm gaze was the same calculating mind that had once run the finances of an empire. Even in his final years of dominance, Meyer Lansky never truly stopped being what he was. A man who turned crime into mathematics, and mathematics into power. Yet as the sun began to set on his reign, even he couldn't calculate the final cost of what he'd built. Because empires, no matter how carefully balanced, always come with debts that numbers can't pay. By the mid-1960s, the winds had shifted for Meyer Lansky, the quiet accountant of the underworld, once untouchable, unseen, and unmatched, found himself facing the slow unraveling of everything he had built. The empire of ledgers and numbers, once his greatest armor, began to close in like a cage. The men he had guided, protected, and enriched were either dead, imprisoned, or replaced by reckless successors who thought the old rules no longer applied. The game had changed, and for the first time, Meyer Lansky wasn't sure he wanted to play anymore. The world was moving into a new age of scrutiny. The once complacent government, humiliated by years of corruption and crime scandals, finally turned its full attention toward organized crime. The hearings of the 1950s had already exposed parts of the mafia to daylight, but now, with technology advancing and surveillance tightening, the shadows grew thinner. The law had learned from its failures, but what truly haunted Meyer wasn't the law. It was time. He was aging. His body, once lean and quick, now felt heavy. His steps slower. The mind was still sharp, but the vessel that carried it had begun to betray him. He'd been living a double life for decades, half in the world of legitimate business, half in the abyss of organized crime. And though he had spent years perfecting the balance, the strain was finally showing. He watched as the world he built began to decay from within. The syndicate he once helped shape into a disciplined enterprise was now fragmented. The younger mobsters didn't care for his rules or restraint. They were loud, greedy, and careless. They flaunted wealth, picked fights with the government, and made headlines. All the things Meyer had warned against. He'd always believed that control was everything. Control of money, control of people, control of oneself. But control, he learned, was temporary. When Fidel Castro's revolution stripped him of his Cuban casinos, it wasn't just money he lost, it was certainty. He'd spent his life proving that intelligence could outwit fate, but fate had humbled him. The Havana dream had turned into a nightmare. All his careful calculations meant nothing against a revolution fueled by ideology and fire. Still, Lansky refused to fade away. He poured what remained of his fortune into offshore ventures and hidden accounts, but the IRS was closing in. Investigators followed every thread, every rumor, every whisper of his hidden millions. They believed he had stashed away over $300 million, a staggering sum for the time, though no one could prove it. And when agents questioned him, Meyer simply smiled, his eyes unreadable. "You can't tax what doesn't exist," he once said. He had mastered the art of invisibility, but now visibility was forced upon him. Newspapers called him the mob's accountant. Television reporters camped outside his modest Florida home. His name, once a secret shared in smoky backrooms, became a headline. To Meyer, that was the worst punishment of all: exposure. He'd spent a lifetime avoiding the limelight, and now he couldn't escape it. In 1970, cornered by investigations and hounded by the press, Meyer did something unexpected. He ran. He fled the United States and sought refuge in Israel, invoking the law of return, which granted citizenship to Jews from around the world. It was the perfect escape, poetic almost. The boy who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe now returned to the land of his ancestors, not as a victim, but as a hunted man. At first, Israel welcomed him. He was seen as a successful American businessman, a symbol of Jewish resilience. But the United States government wasn't willing to let him rest. They pressured Israeli officials, citing his criminal record and connections. The Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, kept tabs on him. Even in the Holy Land, Lansky couldn't outrun his past. When the Israeli Supreme Court finally denied his request for permanent citizenship in 1972, it was a cruel twist. He had nowhere else to go. He was forced to return to America, where federal agents awaited him at the airport. For the first time in decades, the quiet accountant looked cornered. They charged him with tax evasion, conspiracy, and a string of financial crimes. But the government faced the same problem it always had. Meyer Lansky never left fingerprints. His wealth was hidden behind layers of corporations, fake names, and coded ledgers. They couldn't trace the money. They couldn't find the proof. After years of investigations, indictments, and headlines, the most feared accountant in the world walked free once again. But victory didn't feel like it used to. The world had changed too much. His old friends were gone. Luciano had died in exile, Bugsy long buried, and most of the men he once trusted had turned into ghosts or enemies. He was left alone with his memories, a king without a kingdom. The syndicate no longer needed an accountant. It had become a monster of its own creation. In his final years, Meyer lived quietly in Miami Beach. He would sit by the ocean, staring at the horizon for hours, as if trying to calculate the distance between the man he had been and the man he had become. He still received visitors, old associates, curious journalists, even law enforcement agents who secretly admired him. To most he was courteous, polite, even charming. But behind those sharp eyes there was a loneliness that numbers couldn't solve. The FBI never stopped watching him. They believed the fortune still existed somewhere, buried in offshore accounts, hidden under false identities. But if it did, Meyer took the secret to his grave. He never confessed, never revealed where the money went, and never confirmed how much he truly had. Some say he lost most of it. Others believe he left a financial maze so complex that it still exists, hidden in the fabric of global finance. He was diagnosed with lung cancer in the early 1980s. The disease ate away at his body, but his mind remained sharp until the end. Even on his deathbed, he refused to speak openly about his empire. What good would it do? He told one visitor. The money's gone, the people are gone. Only the stories remain. On January 15, 1983, Meyer Lansky died at the age of 80. When the authorities opened his estate, they found only $57,000 in his name, a cruel irony for a man once accused of controlling hundreds of millions. The newspapers called it a mystery. The underworld called it poetic justice. But maybe, for Meyer, it was exactly how he wanted it to end. Invisible, controlled, untraceable. His whole life had been about leaving no trail, and in death he achieved it completely. The boy from Grodno, who once sold newspapers on the streets of New York, had outlived empires, revolutions, and enemies. He had turned the chaos of crime into a system so efficient that it outlasted him. Even decades later, his influence could still be felt. Every modern crime syndicate that laundered money, every offshore bank that hid illicit funds, every casino that masked corruption, all followed the blueprint Meyer Lansky had drawn. His legacy was not in blood or fame, but in mathematics and control. In the end, he had proven one final truth, that in the world of gangsters, intelligence could be deadlier than any gun. Meyer Lansky once said, "I'm not a gangster. I'm a businessman." And perhaps that was true. He didn't kill for power. He calculated it. The man who had once ruled the shadows with silence left behind no trophies, no confessions, no monuments, only whispers. And maybe that was the point. He had built his life on numbers. And when the final sum was tallied, Meyer Lansky had accomplished something no gangster ever truly did. He vanished. By the late 1950s, Meyer Lansky had become a name whispered in every back room where money changed hands. Yet few outside that world could have picked him out of a crowd. He was a ghost in the empire he helped create, a man who had outlasted Capone, Luciano, Siegel, and countless others who once strutted through the smoky corridors of American crime. But even ghosts leave traces, and as the law tightened its noose around the syndicate, Lansky began to feel the walls closing in. He had built his empire on precision and discipline, yet even the most meticulous accountant can't control fate forever. The tide began to turn when government investigators started tracing the shadowy trails of mob money, trails that led back, inevitably, to Lansky's quiet genius. He had always believed in discretion as his greatest shield, keeping his hands clean and his face out of the papers. But the numbers were damning. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, shell companies. His intricate financial web had grown too vast, and cracks began to show. The Internal Revenue Service, once blind to his hidden ledgers, now hunted him with the same persistence he once used to hunt opportunity. Meyer had always trusted his mind to save him. When others drew guns, he drew balance sheets. When they built power through fear, he built it through loyalty and intellect. But age changes every man, and the sharp edges of his youth had dulled into weariness. His closest allies were gone or dead, and the syndicate that once moved in lockstep now splintered under greed and paranoia. Even Lucky Luciano, once his closest friend and brother-in-arms, had been exiled to Italy, his glory days reduced to rumors and fading memories. Without Luciano to balance the temper of younger, reckless mobsters, Lansky became a relic of a more strategic age, a man still respected, but increasingly irrelevant to a world obsessed with immediate profit and brutal spectacle. The FBI's pressure mounted year after year. They couldn't tie him directly to murder or racketeering, he'd made sure of that, but they could smell blood in the water. Tax evasion, money laundering, offshore gambling. It didn't matter how clever his systems were if the tide of evidence was relentless. Lansky's brilliance had always been in making himself untouchable, yet even he began to feel the chill of inevitability. He could sense that the machine he'd built was slipping beyond his control. The younger men who inherited his operations didn't share his patience or respect for the quiet game. They were louder, greedier, sloppier. The old Lansky had once managed crime like a conductor directs an orchestra, every note precise, every player in harmony. Now the music was discordant. Casinos that once hummed with quiet order became breeding grounds for chaos. Havana, his crown jewel, fell apart when Fidel Castro rose to power and seized control. Overnight, millions in assets vanished. Decades of careful planning were wiped away in the blink of a revolution. It was perhaps the only time in his life Meyer Lansky lost control of the numbers. When he fled Cuba, the image of the city still burned in his mind. The neon lights of the Riviera Casino flickering out, soldiers marching down the boulevard, the soft echo of dice rolling for the last time. It was more than a financial loss. It was the collapse of a dream. He had envisioned Havana as the future of organized crime, a paradise where the mob could operate with sophistication and class. Instead, it became a graveyard for his ambitions. He returned to the United States a diminished man, though he never showed it. On the surface, he remained calm, composed, almost defiant in his silence. To outsiders, he still seemed the same inscrutable mastermind. But inside, Meyer knew the empire was slipping through his fingers. Each year, the investigations grew more aggressive, and his circle of trusted allies shrank. Some flipped, others vanished, and those who remained loyal did so out of fear or fading gratitude. The 1960s brought a new kind of enemy, one more relentless than the gangsters he'd outwitted or the politicians he'd bribed. It was the machine of bureaucracy, faceless agents, data analysts, international banking laws. The same system he'd manipulated for decades now turned against him. And unlike the old days, no bribe could make a paper trail disappear. Every transaction, every offshore deposit, became a piece of evidence in a case that seemed to stretch across continents. In his later years, Lansky moved like a man playing chess against time. Each move was calculated, every decision weighed in silence. He shifted assets into hidden accounts, transferred properties to trusted relatives, and sought refuge in the one place he believed could keep him safe, Israel. As a Jew who had fled persecution and built his fortune in a foreign land, he believed the law of return would offer him sanctuary. For a moment it seemed he had found peace under the Mediterranean sun, but peace was an illusion. The U.S. government didn't forget, and neither did the press. Journalists hounded him, calling him the mob's accountant, a title he detested for its simplicity. They painted him as a shadowy genius who could turn blood money into clean fortune with the stroke of a pen. Some called him the smartest criminal who ever lived. Others called him the devil in a suit. But Lansky saw himself differently, not as a gangster, but as a businessman in a world where the rules were written by the powerful for the powerful. He simply learned to play their game better than they did. When Israel denied his citizenship and forced him to return to the United States, it was the final betrayal. He had spent his life building a legacy of intellect and control, only to find himself trapped in the same web he had woven for others. Extradited and placed under indictment, he stood before the law with the same calm expression he had worn his entire life. No panic, no regret, only the quiet resignation of a man who knew he had finally run out of moves. The trial that followed was less a battle than a performance. Lansky's health had deteriorated. His body was frail, his once piercing eyes dulled by time. Prosecutors painted him as the financial mastermind of organized crime, but they could never prove it beyond reasonable doubt. His genius for distance and deniability, skills honed over decades, remained intact. In the end, the case collapsed under its own weight, and Lansky walked free once again. But freedom no longer meant power. His money was scattered, his influence fractured, and the empire he had built was now run by men he neither trusted nor respected. The old guard was gone, and the new breed of mobsters, violent, impulsive, addicted to chaos, had no place for men like him. He retreated into quiet anonymity, living in a modest Miami apartment, walking along the beach like any other retiree. To passers-by, he was just another old man feeding pigeons. But behind those calm eyes still burned the mind that once calculated the flow of billions. He often thought about his old friends, Luciano, Siegel. Even Bugsy's ghost still lingered in his thoughts. They had all chased immortality in their own way, and all had paid the price. Meyer Lansky, the last survivor of that golden age of organized crime, was left to witness its decay. He had outlived his enemies, outsmarted the law, and yet somehow he found no victory in survival. The numbers had always balanced in his favor, but life had a way of presenting debts no ledger could erase. In the quiet of his final years, Lansky's reflections turned philosophical. He'd built an empire on discipline, intellect, and the cold arithmetic of power, but what did it all amount to? The fortune he had hidden across the world was of little use now. The respect he once commanded had faded into myth. He had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones among mobsters and lawmen alike. When he died in 1983, his net worth was officially listed as less than $60,000. Whether that was the truth or another trick of his genius, no one knew. Some claimed he still had hundreds of millions stashed away. Others believed he had lost it all long before his final breath. But for Meyer Lansky, perhaps the numbers never mattered as much as the control they represented. In a world ruled by greed and chaos, control was the only thing he ever truly valued. With his death, an era ended. The last link to the disciplined, calculated underworld of the early 20th century was gone. In his absence, the mob lost its strategist, its architect, its conscience, if it ever had one. Meyer Lansky left behind no monuments, no skyscrapers bearing his name, no graves of grandeur. Just a legacy written in whispers and shadows, where intellect reigned supreme over violence, and where a man could rule the mob without ever firing a shot.